just gonna display that again for you guys. There we go. So today, we have 3 papers to talk you through today, and it's going to be quite an informal format. We want you guys to interact and really give us some questions and really just begin to unpick the papers that we have in front of us, but also equally, just prompt a bit of a discussion and get used to the process of what it takes to dissect the paper on its merits, the good, the bad, the ugly, everything in between. But in a nice, friendly format where you can really just have that sort of discussion. But before we do so, I think the first thing we should do is actually all introduce ourselves as panelists and panel members. So the first thing I'm going to ask, 1 second, is if we can have Clíona, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi guys, so I'm Clíona Kenny and I'm a second year PhD candidate in Birmingham. My research currently looks at eye gaze in joint attention, and I'll be investigating this using EEG, eye tracking and virtual reality.
Lovely. Next, D'Angela.
Hi everyone, my name is D'Angela. I'm a post-baccalaureate. I'll be starting at the NIH in the fall. I actually got my undergraduate degree in kinesiology and I studied exercise science, but I've always loved studying the nervous system and the brain. And I'm so excited to be here today and present this information in a way that is super accessible to people at all levels, especially as someone who does not come from a formal neuroscience background yet. So thank you for being here today.
Perfect. Okay, so next is me. You may have seen me earlier. My name is De-Shaine. I'm a second year PhD student at Imperial College London. And I work in the field of neurotechnology, specifically in developing sensor technology to measure the injured, or monitor the injured brain. I actually come from a chemistry background originally, but made a transition across to neuroscience, but really combining the two together. But yeah, outside of that, I'm really into my sports. I'm into gaming too. So anyone wants to play me on FIFA afterwards, I'm happy to do that. But yeah, that's pretty much me. And next, Tia.
Hello everyone, my name is Tia Riggins and I'm a PhD candidate in biomedical engineering with a focus on neuroengineering at Michigan State. My research looks at implantable probes and how I can figure out how to make the probes last longer because they only last for a few years in the patient. And so I'm specifically looking at reactive astrocytes and basically the calcium channel expression when they see a probe and how they encapsulate the probe and stop the probe from working. I have a background in art. I went to performing arts school and I have a minor in art and I love art. So that's what I do on the side. I like to paint and exercise for fun.
Perfect. So I guess all that's left for us to do is actually to get directly into these papers. So the first one on our schedule is, got it rightly. So this was the pain-based medicine. Sorry guys, seem to have lost it. Bear with me. Yeah, if we just start going through and really just talking about the merits of it. So essentially, this was racial bias with regards to pain.
Wait, we skipped Thiago.
Oh, oh my gosh.
It's fine, whatever.
No, it's not. Thank you for correcting me.
Hi everyone. I'm Thiago. I am a 4th year neuroscience PhD candidate here at the Medical College of Wisconsin. I'm originally from Brazil, been here in the US for almost 8 years now. Yay, there I am. I'm focusing on fetal alcohol syndrome and kind of like using different stem cell models to model that disease. And yeah, I started helping with Black and Neuro a couple of weeks ago. Well, all of us did.
Perfect. So apologies for that. Okay. So the first paper, you would like to start on the merits of the paper.
Yeah, I just wanted to, just so everyone knows what we're talking about, we did provide links to the papers ahead of time. The full title of this one is Racial Bias in Pain Assessment and Treatment Recommendations and False Beliefs About Biological Differences Between Blacks and Whites. I kind of wanted to tie back into the panel earlier today a little bit too, because if you were able to attend it, they talked about a lot of the same things that we're going to talk about today. Yeah, I just wanted to give a little intro there.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, I think the main idea that I took from this paper, I don't know if Shane wants to put it on the screen or not, but in the previous panel, we talked a lot about like the consequences of kind of what this paper tells. So we're talking about like racial bias, and then what happens when you have those biases is patients die. Like these have real consequences in medicine. So I think like one of the first figures that they show is the belief that Black people feel less pain than white people. And if you believe that, you tend to endorse other false beliefs as well. I think it's one of the main things. Well, on the first figure, they talk more about lay people, but yeah, those small beliefs that people usually tend to have before starting their medical training kind of roll over towards their medical training and ended up rolling over to the treatment as well. Yeah. So that was the main table of like different beliefs that people held.
What I appreciated about this paper was that when you're tapping into people's beliefs, it's quite easy to go down a qualitative route, and that's fine. But for me, coming from quite a quantitative background, I like to see some numbers attached to it. I like to see some hard facts to back it up in terms of stats. So what I appreciated was the fact that it was kind of done on a Likert scale, and they were given the scenarios, and they had to rate kind of like how much a certain scenario how much pain they would receive from a certain scenario, what they would rate it as, and then basically compare this as they move forward. And I think what worked well was the fact that you could then draw percentages from that afterwards. So, so obviously study 1 was done on people without medical training. And then study 2 was medical students. And so what does it say? So on average, so for study 1, those without medical training, says on average, participants endorse 22.43% of the false beliefs. So the false beliefs are obviously the statements that aren't true.
Someone asked in the chat to give us to give a brief overview of the paper. So basically, this is from 2015, I think, approved 2016. So 2015, 2016. So it's fairly recent. What this group did was first they evaluated these beliefs of systemic racial bias. So like Black people feel less pain, Black people tend to age faster, they have different nerve endings. They sample like a big population, like a general population on their first study, and then on their second study, they extended that to medical students in, I forgot where it's Princeton. And then they kind of evaluated how that affects how those different biases affects their beliefs in different biological differences. The way that they did that was mostly just surveys for lay people and medical students. And I don't think they have like any complex models or anything like that. It's very much descriptive paper of kind of their opinions and how these opinions affect their beliefs. The main finding was obviously that even people with some medical training, and here we're talking from a US perspective, so people who went to college and are now in medical school, so a couple of years under their belt of education, still have these false beliefs that are related to biological effects. So that obviously affects as we talked in the beginning, that affects their treatment, and in a big population like the US, that ends up affecting racial disparities. So that's the main summary of the paper.
You can see we're getting a couple things in the Q&A as well, and I just wanted to reiterate to attendees to please ask questions in the Q&A. We would love to get some participation from y'all and make sure that we can touch on and expand upon things that you have questions about. So thank you for that if you've submitted questions. It looks like we have one. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
You're right. No, so I've just seen a comment saying, as a linguist, I have an issue with how some of the items are framed. So you can see that some of them are kind of suggestive and they're leading questions. So if we scroll to that part, just a little bit up from the graphs. Yeah. So the first item, blacks age more slowly than whites. That's already kind of predisposing the participant to that belief instead of saying, but you can understand why it had to be a fourth question because it's on a scale. But I do understand that, yeah, these questions are, or these statements are suggestive, and that will lead participants to think in a certain way. But I suppose these are counterbalanced is what I believe, is that there's going to be half of the items will have false beliefs that swap it around so that it.
As we move further down?
No, I'm just reading through the items. So for item 1, we have blacks age more slowly than whites, whereas the inverse of that would be whites age faster than blacks. But then that's still suggesting the same thing. So
yeah, I would definitely say
I don't know how
that.
we'd get around that.
I think the point is definitely valid that is a bit of a limitation. It's very hard to keep these biases out of any sort of questioning that you do, but I would definitely say, yeah, that is a limitation of the paper, that it's suggestive from the start. So the chances of getting a suggestive conclusion are probably much higher. And again, on a point that Clíona made, yeah, definitely the fact that this is very qualitative, and often us as neuroscientists, neurotechnologists, we're used to having more of a quantitative dissection of this. And I guess it's probably the subject matter is very difficult to measure these sort of biases themselves without doing something that's very qualitative. So maybe it's just the nature of what is actually being asked. But it's still very interesting in the findings that it comes to, and really does then suggest that we may have to look in, well, as a wider scale for the US, look into the way certain medics are trained and where these beliefs are formed. And then as people then progress.
So one good question that we also got was, as researchers and students ourselves, if we encounter any of these beliefs in our work. I think so, yeah. I think especially in your first years of your PhD, at least for me, a lot of the lectures and kind of like general reviews that you see of neuroscience are still given based on, like, I wouldn't call old school neuroscience, but like it's given by, I'm afraid of using the word old here, but it's given by more traditional professors and faculty. You eventually see those slides from 1980s and one of the points that we want to make today in general is that these things are systemic. So these beliefs are, they were in textbooks. Some of these are still in textbooks. So yeah, this seeps through some of the first lectures that we see. And then we also have, I think in stem cells, we still have this idea of like using a patient's own sample, especially in induced pluripotent stem cells, where we can get their patient's own stem cells to generate different models. We still have this idea of like, oh, race is just a social construct, shouldn't play any role. And people tend to have basically all white male cell lines. So it's still very much a thing in our research, or at least in mine. I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you see some of those in your research and in your areas?
I would say,
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so sorry. Definitely for me, I see it in the case of stroke. And it says here, whites are less likely to have strokes than blacks. And I don't know, I guess I'll probably go from a UK context, but we do know that there's, well, that Black Caribbeans and Black Africans are actually more likely to suffer from stroke. And this is correlated with hypertension, but at the same time, I would say that this is something that has pervaded and persisted, that we try to blame it on the fact that this is a Black Caribbean person of their origin of being Black Caribbean or Black African, but not talk about the stress factors or what actually happens to them, or the social inequality that leads to them then being more stressed, that then leads to them having hypertension, that then leads to them having a stroke. So I would say, yeah, I definitely do see this. And I have actually been into the clinic where I've been and seen a lot of Black faces in a clinical environment. And you kind of get the idea that you think of yourself then, oh, wow, okay, we're more susceptible to this. Why is this happening? But time after time, we see no conclusive evidence on a genetic side. So it really does beg the question we need to get into, what are the social factors of this? And I think this is kind of what this paper is kind of getting at.
I basically want to piggyback off of what De-Shaine said, basically. So in my research, I use ephemeral probes, and the ephemeral probes can be used to help like tetraplegics or handicapped people regain loss of function that they once had. But the probes have like a very broad, they're very, very broad implications. So the probes could also possibly be used for epilepsy. They could be used for stroke. They could be used for people on pain management. So looking at all these factors, all these ways that probes could be used to treat these neurodegenerative diseases, it kind of does affect my research personally. Right now, I'm just kind of focusing on like the motor cortex, just because that's where the research has been for the past like 50 years. But personally, I've seen, or actually I've heard people in my family even say things like, oh, Black people have thicker skin than white people, so why are we like more likely to get colder than white people? And it's just like, where did you get this from? Where did you pull this out of the sky? And I think that's just because they're older. So a lot of boomers will say, like maybe in the age group, they'll say things along this line. So maybe more millennials and people are like thinking more outside of the box and thinking more of like the social disparities. But people are actually forgetting that Black people are dying from higher rates of stress and stroke and things that are caused by it, because we have to deal with all the things in society that is affected by race, all the things that comes with that, identity and like their social class. So just like Shane said, we really need to look at all these social factors that affect us and our well-being and our quality, because even looking at that and looking at like race, if we go back and even into our communities are more likely to like deal with environmental racism. We're more likely to deal with pollution than wealthy white people. And that pollution in our air, in our water is for sure definitely going to compromise our quality of life and have us live poor life. So all these other factors outside of race contributing to why you're seeing these trends.
I just want to address a couple of the more specific Q&As on this paper, and then we should definitely transition to the next paper. There was a question, someone asked a couple of things about the last statement on here about Black people having stronger immune systems than whites, and how that seems contradictory to the other statements that are making it seem like there are a lot of negatives to being Black, but this one thing doesn't really seem to fit. And I think that goes back to what was talked about in the panel earlier today. I think it was Dr. Doyle who said that there's this contradiction between Black people being seen as subhuman and also as superhuman in a lot of ways. And I think that just points to the real misunderstanding about the social determinants of health, the things that T and De-Shaine talked about as well. And then really quick, somebody asked about sort of the ethics of this study and then being able to do this survey and how this seems unethical. And I kind of wanted to touch on that in general across all papers and across all the ones we're going to talk about today. Because I think we would love to think that all studies are being reviewed by people who have like a good sense of ethics. But there are a lot of studies that there are a lot of things that happen in the past that are currently happening, and a lot of studies that get published that are just wrong. And so I think that points to, and even more points to the need for a critical eye and for a much more nuanced understanding of all these intersections. Because just because we can quantify things in a survey and put numbers and call something data doesn't necessarily mean that the collection was ethical or that the study itself was ethical, just because it's science.
Just to add on to the end of that, I think that also kind of emphasizes the need to diversify panels, because if there was more diversity on a panel who understand and who are familiar, well, we should, to be honest, we should all be familiar that this probably shouldn't have passed ethics, to be honest. But if we had more representation on ethics panels within labs, maybe this type of research wouldn't have slipped through the ropes.
I think we should close on this paper and move on to the next one. But I just wanted to say we're getting a lot of questions, and a lot of them are really good, but we obviously don't have time to address every question that comes in the Q&A. Please, if you have further questions, we would love to be able to answer them. You can reach out to us via Twitter DMs, or if you wanted to email and specifically talk with someone, we could figure out how to do that and make sure everyone's questions are getting answered at some point. But we should definitely move on to the next paper.
So paper 2, can everyone see? This is the right one. So this is racism as a unique social determinant of mental health. This is development of a didactic curriculum for psychiatry residents. Who's gonna start on this? Let's see if I've got that.
I can start real quick. So I kind of wanted to talk about some merits of this paper, and it ties in really nicely with things we've already talked about. So even just in the study, you can see that this is specifically talking about social determinants of mental health. And I wanted to kind of reiterate the importance of looking at not just the data. It's very easy to say Black people are more likely to get depressed and just sort of leave it at that. But looking at the actual determinants of health. So even just in the introduction, it talks about mental health disparities, including inequities in access, symptom severity, diagnosis, and treatment. For African Americans, racism may affect mental health through factors such as poverty and segregation, which have operated since slavery. And so, yeah, that's a really quick summary of a lot of important things about social determinants of health. And I think that's definitely a merit of this paper versus the one we were just looking at. Very different.
Definitely.
I also think it goes back to something that was brought up in the last panel. I forgot who said it. when you have, in this case, they're mostly medical students, or sorry, they're residents. When you have the stress added up of a high stress job, like a residency, or in our cases, graduate school, you also tend to sweep under the rug all the race things, because no one wants to be the one person who's always talking about race, who's always talking about sexism, who's always talking, like, no one wants to be the boring guy or the boring person. And this shows one of the most impressive results is that everyone who attended the lectures and kind of engaged into this new curriculum agreed that it was positive. So it's not just the stress of grad school. Chances are that if you're suffering from race, you are in this racist system, talking about this in an open way will definitely help. And it also doesn't help, or sorry, it also helps that the faculty got involved in this. So it just shows that it's much more systemic and like widespread than we think usually.
There's a Q&A that came in as well that I think ties in really nicely to what we were talking about, and also things that were mentioned in the panel earlier today. They said, I agree that clinical research is highly biased towards white populations. However, I think there are many factors that are involved with this. Trust in medical professionals, access to healthcare / programs. Do you all agree?
Yes.
Yes. There's some interesting papers that look into like the participation of Black people, especially in the US, in research studies. And if you look at the vast history of the US with horrible ethical studies like the one that were brought up in Tuskegee, there's just this gigantic stigma in research in general that it's not going to be conducted ethically, that people are going to be taken advantage of. But I also like to point out that there's like technical things that people never thought of. So we brought up, on the last panel, we brought up skin color. I think Jordan brought up one with sensory stuff, but there's also the new study that showed like how EEG was basically like unavailable for people with natural hair until like last year. So obviously you're not going to shave your head for volunteering for like $50 an hour to do an EEG study. So all those things compound on top of each other. So all those things add up to like people not having the guts to go to a doctor to talk about these things or to participate in a study that might take advantage of them.
Yeah, I would recommend on the topic of what we're talking about, definitely go check out the Twitter threads that we're posting today. This goes into a lot of history of unethical studies and some of the very real reasons why Black people, and in general people of color, not just Black people, feel hesitant about participating in studies, in clinical trials and vaccines and things. There's a very very real history of Black people being taken advantage of by medical professionals. And so that fear and that uncertainty is definitely very valid.
One last point, if you've ever been to one of these research studies, it was brought up before of the ethics behind this. So ever since Tuskegee, ever since we started paying more attention to the ethics of all of this, every study like this is required to have informed consent forms. If you ever participate in one of those, you can attest to how long they are. They are like 15, 20 pages long, going over like hundreds of potential things of like biodatabases and how your data is going to be stored and how it's going to be destroyed if you want. For a lot of people, that is not in any way approachable. Like to have a 30-minute discussion when you're late for work, when you have school, when you have other things, to have a 30-minute discussion just to go over like informed consents. Not saying that informed consents are bad. I'm just saying that it's not always approachable to have like these very in-depth things. And also there's studies that show that some people that do volunteer for these studies sometimes also don't fully understand, like, even though it is the researcher's job to make sure people understand, most people like just gloss over in that part as well.
I've found that quite a lot with EEG studies as well. I found that people haven't been informed about the process of EEG, and there'll be people with braids and natural hair, and you'll see the researchers struggling to put on the cap, because even though there is the solution that was kind of publicized on the internet, how many labs actually have that? How many labs have actually taken the time to adapt their equipment in order to include Black people? It's a fraction. And there have been a lot of people who have kind of come in thinking that it's one thing, and then it's not until that the researcher's struggling with the cap on, but they may not want to say like, I'm unable to do this because of your hair or your braids or whatever it is. And then there's this moment of conflict, or there's this moment of stillness where it's kind of like no one knows how to approach the situation. But if that was made clear beforehand, that situation could have been avoided.
I kind of want to piggyback off of Cleona's answer. So in undergrad and being me at Ohio State, they require you to take a bioinstrumentation class. And so everyone has to do an EEG, an EMG, and an EKG on each other. And so when it became my turn, I was like the first, I was like the only, I was the only Black grad, I mean, not Black grad student, Black undergrad in being me, and we were the first graduating class. And I actually had twists like this at the time was going on. And I didn't think, and I was like, oh my gosh, I should have like prepared my hair, whatever. So I remember like being off the side of class and like taking all my twists down, and then like doing everything I could so that they could put these EEGs and like this glue into my scalp for like a 15-minute trial. And it took me like almost the whole entire class to do it. And then once they like took the recordings off for like a quick like 5 or 10 minutes, you know, I had to, you know, eventually wash my hair and do that. Like, so it isn't very clear. A lot of people don't know. And that was me, like knowing the curriculum going into it. It's just a hassle dealing with that and all of that. So yeah, just to agree with what she's saying, it is kind of a hassle dealing with that. And the glue is crazy, sticky, nasty. So yeah.
Well, the fact that you know, the part of doing things like that is preparing the participants ahead of time. And this is a class that you were taking, right? So like ideally the people would have known in advance that this is something that everyone should be aware of. They, you know, you should have known that ahead of time going into that you were going to, you know, you should have been able to come into that experience prepared. And that's at the fault of the people who were in charge of the study or in charge of the class. So, you know, it just points to another like lack of awareness, a lack of discussion amongst people, amongst professors.
I don't think the instructors really know. They don't really understand what it's like to have like curly or kinky hair. So they don't know much. Even when you go to a beauty shop, you have to be careful who do you go to do your hair, because everyone doesn't know how to do curly hair.
I think that actually ties in really well with this. We've had a couple questions related to sampling and advertising bias at universities doing clinical research. How does doing these studies at predominantly white institutions, which will mainly have white people, obviously, and advertising studies at these PWIs further leave out Black people from clinical research? And do you have any suggestions for how institutions might circumvent that? There's another question as well, very related, that was basically saying, I wonder if the limited participation also comes from poor research advertising, i.e. not making advertisements accessible for people who are not white. I think that's definitely a huge part of the problem. Something that just came to my mind on this topic is like, for example, the Stanford prison experiment. A lot of psychologists still to this day make a lot of generalizations about the results from the Stanford prison experiment. And that was entirely white males who attended Stanford at the time. And there, you know, to this day, people use that study to make generalizations psychologically about, you know, large populations. And so, yeah, definitely.
I also think one of the proposed solutions, and this is very much in vogue right now with COVID and the rest of the world on fire, there is a lot of open share, or not open, but share data that's going on between labs. So a lot of fMRI labs are starting to, I'm not gonna say make their data available, but they're starting to share data with other people. With fMRI, I believe it's like huge databases, so it's a little bit more complex on the server side of things. But EEG data, patient data, especially epidemiological data and other types of kind of like data that you can gather at one place and basically email to someone else. I know some of my friends in like public health and other types of research that deal with that kind of data have not been able to interview people or survey people since the pandemic started. That's what they've been doing. And that's just one more contradiction that the pandemic shows, that we can do this. So like, I live in Milwaukee, which is one of the most segregated cities in the US, and our school tries a lot to go and like reach the communities that are very much different than where we are right now, which is in the suburbs. There is a million issues of a predominantly white school going to a predominantly Black neighborhood and asking for research participants. Like, you can't just post flyers on telephone posts and expect people to come to your university for an EEG. So it's on one point, it has to be much more a community-based effort of people who actually live in those communities having relationships with the university. And if it is like a whole neighborhood or a whole city wide that doesn't have any diversity, doesn't have any Black people, basically, if it is a white city, you can always do those online things. And also there's always the chance that most people won't be interested in that kind of research in that university, likely. You see that over and over again. The research institutions that are usually funded or pursue some questions are usually the ones that are affected by the downstream effects of that research. So in this case, I think it was in Boston, right? Yeah, it was in the Massachusetts, I can never pronounce that state's name, MA General Hospital. So it obviously is a more diverse population compared to, I don't know, North Wisconsin. So it's usually, it does have a geography component to it, but that geography component also also dictates what research is done in the place.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with Thiago. I think most communities are not gonna trust the researchers unless they look like them. So researchers have to do, not researchers, but institutions have to do more to recruit more people of color if they want to affect communities of color.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Yael, but to answer the question, this is like what we're already talking about, but just to reiterate, how can we help other researchers to advise incoming participants about things like Black hairstyles? We have this problem for MEG too. Should we, so we've already been talking about this, but I think probably the most direct way to better access and communicate with populations of Black people and other people of color is to put more funding into HBCUs. Put more money into research studies that are coming out of historically Black colleges and universities, because those obviously are not predominantly white institutions. And if we are putting more money into those institutions so that they can do the studies, then they themselves can target the communities that they are a part of directly, and they can make sure that all these things are being effectively communicated to people. So yeah, support HBCUs.
And also have diverse, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to add, because another problem that's highlighted within this is when we have Muslim women coming in to the labs who also want to participate, if they have a headscarf on and they're not aware that they need to take this off in order to participate within these studies. And so one thing that I try to encourage is literally, so you put up a poster, you say that you're recruiting for this research, you leave your email, someone emails you. Within that response to the email, you provide them with information about the study. Within that, say, just say, you need to make it very explicit to participants of the general public what the process will be. And to highlight things like if you are wearing a hijab, if you have cane rows, these are things that that maybe aren't compatible with your piece of equipment at the time. But in the same breath, knowing that your equipment isn't compatible, you now need to think about getting funding to get equipment that is compatible and feed into that.
I think it would be good to. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that also have diverse faculty, have diverse researchers. If you have someone with dreadlocks, if you have someone with a headscarf, that person will know to tell that participant. It also go back to representation science. So if you have that diversity in your population of researchers, in your population of faculty members, they will know of these things before they start designing these experiments, before they start asking volunteers.
Real quick, as I think we should wrap up and move on to the third and final paper. This question that we got, how prominent do you think the role of epigenetics is in perpetuating generational stresses and trauma from slavery era versus the more direct impact of modern day systemic racism in causing physiological effects?
It's difficult to say the least. We're like crawling babies in the role of epigenetics in almost anything. Like the papers that you still see to today. In my case, I study the effects of ethanol in developing brain. We see things like transgenerational effects of fodder. This is all in vitro studies for now, but we see transgenerational effects of alcoholic fathers or alcoholic cells, male cells, when they generate, when they basically, well, this was done in mice, but we see transgenerational effects like that, where a father that was alcoholic conceives a baby with the mother that didn't drink any alcohol, with similar effects of a fetal alcohol syndrome patient. So and obviously the father's not getting pregnant. It is all epigenetics changes of the sperm quality and things like that. There's a whole gigantic review that I used for my dissertation that touches on transgenerational effects of stress, age. I think they touch a lot on like element like nutrition and stuff. We don't know. It seems like everything affects your epigenetics. Even in things like in vitro fertilization, we see some changes and some things like effects that the mother has that has nothing to do with the genetics of the embryo. So we don't know. It's the short answer, but it definitely plays an effect. We just don't know to what extent and how.
Sorry, I just thought before we move on, I just want to touch on this question because I think it's really good. I noticed the paper touches on police brutality that happened in 2015 and its effects on the mental health of Black people. Have you seen much academic discussion about long-term mental health of Black people in context of the current BLM protests and the pandemic? I don't feel like I can answer this necessarily because I'm not currently involved in any formal research, but all y'all that are doing research right now, what do you think?
I think we can talk about like how it affects us personally, because I feel like after seeing all this and like all this trauma happening to Black bodies, it's like, okay, I really had to take like a couple of days off where I would just wake up and cry, seeing people I don't even know, just knowing that they lost their lives, not doing anything, just existing by being Black. And it's like, I had to sit down and like talk to my advisor and be like, I can't write, I can't do anything today because I feel like crap. I feel like if I walk outside, someone's gonna like run me over or do something crazy to me just because my skin's Black. And I have to like go to therapy for it. So I don't know, like I don't do research in this realm, but I can just speak from my personal experience and how that affects my mood and my mental state.
I think this definitely goes back to the need for adequate representation amongst like PIs and leaders in research, because so like in your case, T, like you were able to go to your PI, I think is what you said, and actually explain that, you know, you need to take a couple days, or, you know, I need some extra space. I need you to be aware that this is something that's affecting me. And to be honest, I don't think that these conversations happen. If they do happen, they're not happening enough, unless it's actually between the people that it's affecting at this point. So like, I know that I can talk to all of y'all in Black and Neuro, and we can have these honest discussions and this dialogue together because, you know, we can be honest about that kind of thing. But I know that that's not the norm. That's not something that we can all look forward to outside of this space. So short answer, no, I think, but there definitely needs to be more.
I guess final point, and I 100% agree with you. I think that's even more of a problem in the UK, actually. Not directly with regards to police brutality, but in terms of systemic racism, just because we have a lot less of a critical mass, and also because a lot of conversations in terms of around racism and systemic racism are still very much denied in a lot of our institutions. So we see, as we talked about earlier in the panel before, we see these disparities in the same way we do in the US. But in terms of recommendations, and a lot of recommendations have been put forward in terms of critical action that's being done to remedy these recommendations, we see very little, if not none. So yeah, I think, yeah, this definitely needs to be considered for research and for studies, but it needs to be considered for Black students en masse who have gone through a period of lockdown plus a pandemic of police brutality, and a pandemic of seeing systemic racism realized across the board. I think this is something that needs to be considered holistically, to be honest, for Black students in general. But I guess with that, we will move to the last paper. Sure. The last paper is, go back to the top, variable dialect switching among African American children. And this is inferences about working memory.
This is a pretty dense and long paper. I think the main summary for it, we're not going to go through like all the figures and models because they're very complex. The main summary is that this group is kind of like trying to understand how code switching, especially in African American students, you have to switch between I forgot the technical term, but like more technical standard English and African American English, how that ties in with their math abilities, their working memory abilities, and other cognitive abilities. So they go very in deep into the linguistics of it. So looking into how things like switching was and were in grammar sentences, or switching past tenses, how each one of those little changes that they have to do every day when they're at school versus when they're at home, how does that change their ability to go and take a test in math, which usually you think that they're unrelated, that especially if you believe in that old school idea of like, this area of my brain's for math, this area is for language. You think that doesn't have any effect, but what they show here is that, yes, some of these changes, some of these small little linguistic switches that they have to turn on and off do affect their ability to process and to basically work around math problems. Sometimes for the best, sometimes for the worst. A lot of times it's no, but it's just another instance of a whole world of like children that we're not that we're not paying attention, but that the system doesn't pay attention to, because a lot of the times you'll see just white teachers saying like, just speak correctly, just say the right words. It's just kind of wild how this paper is from 10 years ago and you still see things like that. You still see professors, a lot of professors online arguing for correct grammar. And I personally seen some pretty bad instances of like a speaker that starts saying y'all and it's like you see faces across a seminar room. So yeah, I don't know, what were you guys' thoughts? It's a pretty dense paper.
I guess I just wanted to touch on like the immediate takeaway merit of this paper for me. It's just the fact that this study is really validating the idea of code switching. Because I know when I was growing up, my experience in school, going to predominantly white public schools, is that I was often told by teachers that ain't's not a word, ain't's not in the dictionary or whatever. First of all, it is now, but also, I think that speaks to the lack of understanding around what code switching is, and just sort of the fact that the African-American vernacular is often not taken seriously as like a legitimate form of language and communication. And so, yeah, I just think even, this paper definitely points to, somebody asked in the Q&A, I'm wondering how this study fits into the broader idea of cognitive advantage of bilingualism. And I think those definitely tie in together. Yeah.
So one interesting question that is like kind of related to all the papers that we discussed today was if we have brain circuits in specific regions of quote unquote the brain of a racist, and we don't, because racism is a very complex thing. We have very specific areas in the brain that identify faces, and we see things like, I'm not going to go super in detail because I don't remember the details of the paper, but there are papers that show that white people feel when show a face of a black person versus a face of another white person, they'll like their brain activates in different patterns. You can correlate that to like surveys and different like measures of racism. We still don't have a lot of those studies. What we do have is like a lot of studies on just general biases, like things if you flash pictures of, I don't know, let's get away from like just African Americans for a second. If you flash pictures of a Mexican flag and ask a person like for like half a millisecond, then ask a person to like, what's the first word that comes to your mind? You can dictate or like at least make some correlations of what biases are and where they're being activated in the brain. And then the second part of their question was any changes in protein expression during development as a result to exposure to racism. I don't know of any. I would imagine yes, just because racism adds stress and stress changes your whole physiology.
Yeah, I think in general, there's no real definitive answer to this question, just because the issue of racism is a very complex and multifaceted issue, and ties into, sort of incorporates a lot of more basic ideas about brain function, so things like stress. I also want to make sure, because we're getting to the end of this discussion here, we've gotten a couple questions about more generally how you approach reading a paper. Someone asked, how do you approach reading and understanding mathematical models in papers? And then another question was, what's the first thing you look at when reading a paper which ties together neuroscience and race? For example, do you check if the author list is diverse, where the research was conducted, how diverse the sample was? So yeah, if we could spend the last, or these next couple minutes talking, not specifically about any of these three papers, but in general about approaching, picking papers apart.
Before we get into that, I just wanted to highlight one of the questions, which I think is like it's a key point, right? So we've had a comment saying task switching is known to impose a cognitive load. Assuming that cognitive reserves are limited, it is absolutely reasonable to predict that task switching will be associated with decreased performance in other tasks. If so, similar effects should be seen in people who are multilingual. A question could be, is there a disadvantage even when a person is code switching as opposed to when they are not? So I think that kind of ties in with what D'Angelo started with there, which I believe a lot of papers come on the attack. Instead of saying like, hey, you're switching between two languages here, essentially, like, this is incredible. What can we learn from this, and how can we apply it in other spaces and in other fields and in just other areas? In a lot of research, we do seem to kind of focus on the negative and find out what the problem is, instead of saying like, hey, this is pretty cool. How can we use it and kind of make use of it? But yeah, sorry.
Should we continue about just broader sort of how we dissect papers in general? I guess one thing that I find is critical for me is not looking at a paper in isolation. It's actually looking at the supporting literature or what has come before it. I think that's really key for any paper that I look into. I'm looking at what prior knowledge is it building on, what has it missed out, what is it referencing to, and yeah, that's how I really then begin to form a decision about whether it's something I'm not just going to take seriously, but what literature is it then building on and supporting. And I guess that can be very different to, again, if it's something that's about neuroscience and race, but that's very important definitely in neuroengineering, because you're looking at, especially if it's a certain device or a fabrication, that procedure has come from somewhere else and it's been built on and iteratively made better. So that's the sort of thing I look for in a paper, is what came before. And I think that definitely would tie into something with neuroscience and race, like what prior knowledge are they building upon, or are they making bold statements without any prior evidence? Because that's clearly when you can begin to poke holes in something like this, or in a journal in general, when these claims are quite unsubstantiated.
I think that ties in with, sorry. I think so that ties in with what I look at in papers, which is the methods, and just looking at the procedure and looking at what experiment are you doing, and is it testing what you think it's testing? Because there's a lot of research that builds upon older research, but were those prior assumptions actually accurate, and are you tapping into the mechanisms that you think you are? So yeah, sorry whoever I interrupted.
I want to touch really quick on this question about approaching reading and understanding mathematical models in papers. From my perspective as like a relatively young scientist, I would say that I tend to focus less on models and the math and stuff, just because if it's unapproachable to you, like, you know, if you're looking at a paper and you feel like, oh, this has a lot of figures and graphs and charts, and I don't really know what all these numbers and letters and stuff mean, I would say don't worry about that too much. Like, focus more on the key takeaways. Like Clíona said, like really look into the methods, try to think about, what was the procedure and the process that the participants were put through. Again, the key takeaways and things like that. So yeah, just really quick.
And that kind of goes to like science in general, not necessarily like science and race or neuroscience and race. You'll never read the same paper. Like you can read the same paper twice and have completely different conclusions based off that. And this goes to a lot of the young graduate students, when you're starting your first like lit reviews and you're starting to like, especially if you're like in a field like, I don't know, Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, these things have like hundreds of thousands of papers and now millions of papers out there. One, you're not going to get through all of them. Two, if you try to like sit down and read every single page of that paper, you're going to take almost nothing from it. So sometimes you're going to read a paper where you're literally just going to go, okay, what model did they use? What were their findings? And it takes you 5 seconds to take that away. Sometimes you're going to read a paper just for the intro because you want to like learn more about like, why are they studying this? Why is this important? Sometimes you're going to read a paper and not care about like the results. You literally just care how they do this. So you're always going to like approach different papers in different ways, which in the case of like racism in science, you also have to be careful. Like some of these papers are going to have been published for 10 years, have no citations, have never been like anywhere, and they have like a super clickbaity title. That's probably not a great paper. Like if they interviewed 10 people and like came to like a gigantic conclusion about the human status, it's probably not an amazing resource, which is different in the papers that we chose here, which like have been discussed. You can always also check like what other people are talking about this paper. So when you log in on Google Scholar or PubMed or whatever you're using, you can see not just like how many citations it has, but like where was it cited? Was it cited just by the same authors from the same lab over and over again? Or is it cited on different reviews? Is it cited on like editorials? Is it cited by like people who are discussing this over and over again? I think those things help to like understand if the paper is actually important or not, because unfortunately there's, as we've seen the last couple of weeks, there's still a lot of garbage that gets published.
T, did you have something?
Oh, I was just talking about how like look at the figures and see what the claims are. So Shane mentioned it earlier. What are people saying in their papers? Like, are they making big claims? And does the data back up what they're saying? So also too, once you get into lab and you start doing like your own technique and your assays and whatnot, cell culture, whatever you're doing, you're gonna be more knowledgeable of what results look like, what publishable results look like. So you'll be more able to look at other papers and be like, okay, this looks right, this doesn't look right, and this is weird.
Yeah, we're getting to the end of our time here because the session is only running for an hour today. I wanted to just really quick before we all close, reiterate that we had a lot of questions asked today and we were not able to answer all of them. Please feel free to reach out to us on Twitter or via our email, which you can find on the website. We also, this is the first iteration of the Black and Neuro Journal Club. We definitely want to have more of these, although we haven't figured out exactly how many and how often. And then asked if we could please link the third paper for attendees to view.
All on our website.
Yeah, well, apparently the third one is not available for free. So we'll look into that after this and make sure that you have access to that. I'm sorry about that. But yeah, again, thank you all so much for being here. And then, yeah, whatever else any of y'all wants to say.
If you have suggestions for papers, for more journal clubs, for more topics you want to talk about, you guys have all of our social medias, and yeah, follow everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you all for tuning in.